Hello, it's May 10th, 2020. I'm Greg Farrar, and this is my COVID-19 Trends live stream. I'll start, as I do, with the countries of the world, then go to the states of the United States, and finish with the counties of California. So looking here at the countries, as always, the United States in total cases leads the rest. Maybe worth. I usually don't spend much time on this graph because it doesn't adjust for population.
Hello, it's May 10th, 2020.
Here we go.
I'm Greg.
Doing that usual thing where it talks back to me. My audio is. It doesn't adjust for population, and so it really makes some countries seem much more important than they are, in a sense. But still, I'm going to zoom in so we can get a very broad picture of what the shapes of these trends are. The ones that are headed upwards, like Russia and Brazil, are the ones that have a decided problem. These are ones that are actually accelerating. Also, the United Kingdom. The ones that are flattening out are the ones that are doing better and that are certainly not growing exponentially and don't seem to have a serious problem, or at least they're recovering from a serious problem. There aren't many right now that have a really strong upward tilt. Again, we see Russia, which actually seems to be outrunning its trend line here, which is particularly bad news. Brazil as well, also outrunning its trend line, so probably accelerating. UK is upwards, but not as sharply and not outrunning its trend line, so that is probably a sign that UK is going to be is peaking or even better. We'll see that much more in the graphs below. If we look overall, is this really my whole graph? Interesting. I have changed my scale so it doesn't go back quite as far, and so we see this thing where we can't tell where the United States came from. It just seems like it started at 30,000 and has been there forever, but of course it started at 0 like everyone. Nevertheless, the short-term graph by country shows a decline over the past month or so in the cases of the United States, a gradual decline, and whereas Russia and Brazil are rising, and the rest of the countries in total numbers are just not major contributors, really. If you added all these up, they'd be probably bigger than the big ones, but the United Kingdom may be showing a slight decline. But here again, I really do prefer to look per capita. Just got some feedback that other people like that I look per capita as well, and this is the place where we can really see, well, on the one hand, per capita properly hides the United States in the pack by recognizing the United States just has a lot more population. On the other hand, it does interesting things like bringing Qatar way out of the pack. This indicating here that Qatar, and we've seen this, but it's 24th on our list of total new cases. Qatar is an extreme outlier here. Everyone else is seeing 100 cases per million, and Qatar is up at 500 new daily cases per million. It's about 4 times your typical, even the big countries. So Qatar is seeing some extremely large number of new cases. Now, as I will try to continue to emphasize, these could be real new cases, actual new infections, or they could be testing, new cases discovered by ramp-ups in testing. Because this is so dramatic, I'm going to flip down to the testing numbers real quick and just get a sense of where is Qatar in the total testing. Interesting, very interesting. So I think that Qatar just arrived here on our list today. I don't think we've even talked about this country. It's not a big country, but it is doing extraordinarily well in testing. It is the best of the top 25 in testing. As you may recall, if you've been watching me for a while, Iceland takes the cake with about 15 or 16% now of their total population tested. And there are a few other smaller countries, Bahrain and Luxembourg also, and Lithuania, I guess, is now doing well, which have in the range of 6, 7, 8% tested. In the top 25, no one's close to that, but it looks like Qatar has now arrived and has the highest testing of the top 25, now that it is broken into the top 25. So what does this mean? Well, we don't know. We never know whether this indicates whether the upswing in, just remember this graph though, that we have a high testing rate. We don't know whether the upswing of Qatar in whether the way that it's burst away from the pack in total new cases is due to a large number of cases that were previously not known before but have now been exposed by the testing, or whether it's because there are actually a lot more cases whether we're seeing some exponential growth here. I'm guessing it's a combination of the two. That probably Qatar really is having a problem of getting new infections, but at least it is testing extensively, and so it's getting some sort of a handle on that. We can see that this curve does not swing upwards sharper and sharper as we go to the right. It seems to be flattening off even. But on the other hand, the most recent 2 days are extreme. 500 new cases per million have been discovered 2 days ago. And this is a rolling average, actually, of 7 days. So we're smoothing the data here a little bit. But you can think of it as 500 people for every million we're finding every day have this this disease in Qatar. So that's certainly, if nothing else, it means, barring something really extreme like complete testing failures or some of the wilder conspiracy theories, at least it means that there are a ton of people there that have the disease, for so many to have been discovered, a ton of people relative to their population, which again is quite small. And if we look where they actually stand when we're not correcting for population, 30,000 new cases in the United States every day, 10,000 for the next contenders, and 1,000 in Qatar of actual cases every day. So the United States is doing 30 times more cases every day than Qatar, but and so it looks like it's just noise. But then when you adjust for population, you see there seems to be something really dramatic happening there. And certainly they're testing at a dramatic pace, not radically above the leaders, but they are the leader in the top 25. And I'm guessing, we certainly know there are a ton of cases there, or they couldn't be turning them up with all those tests. So somewhere in between, we have an epidemic there. They are a hot spot, and their testing is so large that they're catching a lot of cases, and probably that's why we're seeing the curve, it's not even the flattening the curve in the traditional sense of taking the same curve and making it last longer, but we're seeing a peaking of the curve, flattening as it reaches the top. And on the other hand, it's not obvious at all, looking at the most recent days, that this is actually peaking. Broadly speaking, over a couple weeks, it seems like it might be, but then we look at the most recent few days, and those are records. So definitely something to keep track of. Qatar has burst into the top 25 nationwide because they have so many cases, and not just relative to population. As I recall, the top 25 is actual total cases. So this relatively small country, I don't know the population off the top of my head. Actually, I'll just look it up. I'm always saying this. Don't know the population. Well, it's really easy to find. You won't be able to see me searching. Okay, so 3 million people, not tiny, but 100th the size of the United States, has now got far more per. 100th the size of the United States has a 30th as many cases as the United States. So this is where we're seeing this threefold multiplication here, where it's way above everyone else. So I'm spending time on this really just to emphasize again that there's this very big question that we don't know the answer to, which is, as we see cases growing, which we do across the board, a month ago it looked like everything was kind of recovering, heading towards recovery. Not true today. When we look at the new cases, there's not a sign that we're heading towards recovery right now. We're roughly flat. And when we say, why is that? The two possibilities, as with Qatar, are we just have a lot more cases in every country, every state, every county of California, and worldwide. Not all of them, but broadly, we have a lot of places that just have a lot of new infections. The disease is spreading. That's option A. Or B, the disease isn't spreading. We're not really disjoint, but I'll just present that for the moment. Either the disease is growing, or the testing is picking up cases that were already there. And really, it's a mix of the two. My guess then is Qatar, the disease is growing and testing is picking up what's there. We look in somewhere like New York, my guess is the disease is shrinking, and the increased testing is finding fewer and fewer new cases because there aren't any more. There aren't many more new cases, as we'll see when we get to the States. And same in Spain and Italy and a lot of these places, they can test all they want, and I don't think they're going to turn those curves back to look like Qatar here because they just don't have new cases appearing because they've actually contained the epidemic. So, not so Qatar, definitely our hotspot of the world right now, in the top 25 at least. But on the other hand, a very small, it's 24th on 25, so the total number of people involved isn't huge. And since it's flattening off, I have a feeling we will be seeing Qatar for a brief visit on these graphs for a week, and then it'll disappear because it'll head back downward and it'll become number 26 and 27. Bye bye, Qatar. So, that. Now, Singapore, we see, which was definitely looking problematic, has truly leveled off in new daily cases. It's looking pretty good here. Not dropping yet, but leveling off. And we have a lot of places like Ireland and elsewhere that are headed south in a good way. Europe as a whole has generally peaked and is dropping. We can see from this graph, and that will probably become even more clear from the rope chart, which will show the growth rates by day. Peru, we can still see poking its head here as the part of this new epicenter we're seeing in Central and South America. But these lines get challenging here, so I'm going to the rope chart. One thing to note, very interesting, definitely the dominant feature of this rope chart. Well, there are two dominant features in the rope chart. One is that everyone's horizontal. The rope is extremely consistently horizontal, which means that most countries are holding exactly where they are in growth rate. If they're growing 5%, they've been doing that for a while. If they're shrinking 5%, they've been doing that for a while. And we'll see there are some cross-cutting lines, but there's a real sense here that this is not a woven rope like we've sometimes seen, but it's just a bunch of parallel strands, which is interesting. And we haven't really seen that in the past. I don't know quite what to make of that. Why would a country steadily hang at 5% when it could be, you expect it to get over it and then start dropping? And why does that happen? I don't know. But that's what we're seeing right now. And the other dominant thing is that Ecuador is doing extremely well right now, having had a 35% day-over-day growth rate to go with some other recent low days. And again, these are averages of 7 days, each of these points. So this is pretty well denoised and pretty significant as an indicator that we actually are having a consistent trend downward in Ecuador over the past week. And that's being represented by this very sharp decline in the rope chart. More than 20% drop in Ecuador. So Ecuador, which was the first of our Central South America cluster to pop on the radar and was looking very bad a week or two ago, now seems to be solidly recovering. Others were Brazil and Mexico. Chile was the other one. Brazil and Chile were also very problematic. No one here is looking very problematic unless you count this red line here, which is Iran. Even Iran isn't looking that bad with a 6% daily growth rate. That's a lot. That certainly adds up day over day, 6% more new cases every day. And more problematically, that's accelerating right now. But we don't see that in a lot of these cases. We see a lot of countries with a positive growth rate. Chile, as I mentioned, still the new epidemic center in Central South America, seems to be going strong with Chile at 8% daily growth and slightly accelerating, but at least it's slightly accelerating and not dramatically. Brazil also seems to have leveled off at about a 7% growth rate, but it's not heading down either. On the other hand, we do see Belarus. Actually, that must be new. I don't remember talking much about Belarus, but as this heads downward, we can see that it seems to have crossed that zero line, the line indicating zero growth in new daily cases. And so now we're just barely starting to see Belarus lose its momentum in a good way, and seeing a slight daily reduction of new cases each day over the day before. But for the most part, there's not a lot of change in this graph. We have an unusually stable world right now. No sharp ups and downs, with just those few exceptions. Mostly very stable in where these are. Now The other, I guess, important fact about this rope chart is that it's about half above zero, which is a thick horizontal line with a zero marked on the left, and it's about half below zero, which means about half the countries of the world are growing in cases daily, and half are shrinking in cases daily. So this is a stable, steady state epidemic right now, where we're seeing some growth and some shrinkage, but no dramatic changes. And we've kind of had this sense for a week, really, that it's hovering around zero as a world, and we had been better than that. We had been clearly been showing a trend towards negative growth worldwide. No longer. That is either due to testing, and certainly testing has a big part of this, or it's due to an actual new epidemics, or a collection of new epidemics. I would guess that Iran is an actual epidemic, and that Central South America, I don't think they're ramping up testing a lot faster than everyone else, so I would guess that they actually are seeing at least a small scale growth of new cases, really underlying in terms of the underlying numbers, but we don't know that from this. We will look at testing a little bit later, very soon actually, in order to get a sense of whether countries really are accelerating their testing, which they are, by the way. New cases, yeah, interesting. Well, okay, this is a very small scale. Why is this scale so small? It's because we've now switched to this 7-day moving average, so we don't see these radical 20% numbers very often. In order to have 20% growth worldwide, the whole world would have to average 20% every day for 7 straight days, and that just never happens. And so we're seeing a more of a clustering around the zero line as we have removed some of the more extreme data points by averaging them with their 6 neighbors. So, but anyway, after doing that and trending and looking at the trend line, our best guess is that the world is trending slightly upwards in new cases, about 1% per day. Not good, but that's what we're seeing in the data. Again, maybe it's testing, maybe it's the underlying infection rate. And if it is the underlying infection rate, why is that growing? Well, maybe it's because there are a lot of reasons, but one possibility is willpower fatigue, as people get tired of lockdowns and cease to honor them, or actual removal of lockdowns, which is certainly happening all over the place. When we remove a lockdown, we can expect to see an uptick of infection rates, assuming that lockdowns are effective in any way. Yeah, I believe they are, so I'm not surprised to see some upticks in infection and to see the world as a whole rising a little as Europe and many other places are, in the United States, are releasing lockdowns. I'm not going to look at deaths. They often very much match the cases, so I'm going to skip on in order to keep this moving. I will look at testing, though. Total percent tested. We looked at this briefly. Qatar is the leader. The surprise leader, I'd say, because I just have not seen them in the news, but there's something that they have done very well in testing. We tend to sort of see this sense that I'll look them up probably later, but I wouldn't be surprised if there's some industry supporter of testing. The funder of this particular live stream, Joby Aviation, my employer, is also doing quite a bit of other types of funding of helping with COVID-19, including creating a giant temporary hospital in Monterey County, California, and putting together, they've supported the UCSC in creating a small testing lab there, and we are in progress of creating a vastly accelerated testing procedure or lab or something that, assuming it does eventually come online, will significantly increase California's testing capacity. And we see Rhode Island, where CVS, based there, probably is due to their exceptionally high 15% testing. And I don't know why Iceland did so well, but I wouldn't be surprised if they had a corporate sponsor there as well. So you hear about Qatar. I don't know a lot about Qatar, but my sense is they're a rather technologically advanced country, and it may well be that they've got some pharmaceutical company help there. Or maybe just the government has decided we're going to test the heck out of this thing. However it happened, someone big probably got behind it and said we're gonna test this as much as we possibly can. And so Qatar leads. Italy and Belgium have been working on this for a long time and are doing very well. Russia, interestingly, also is doing well and accelerating. Canada and the United States, the leaders in total population tested among the top 25. And really in the world, there are a handful of very small outliers, I'd call them, Iceland in particular, that Iceland and Bahrain and Luxembourg and I guess Lithuania. Well, actually, there are quite a lot of them when you really start looking at some of these other ones that lead these top 25 that have 6% or more of total testing, total population tested. But among the top 25, the United States is in the upper side of that pack. All right, let's move on to the states of the United States. So I'm going to reload this just because my graphs tend to go wonky when I leave them sitting for too long. It only takes a couple seconds. New York will always be, I actually think literally will always be the leader in total number of cases. They are flattening out, but I am, as usual, more interested in the total daily cases, or even more in the total daily cases per million. I'll just briefly look at the total daily cases. New York has this great curve to it right now, 75% off its peak or more. New Jersey also looking very good. So those two, which were by far the worst, have now moved into maybe second and third place behind, I'm guessing this is Illinois. Yep, Illinois, certainly our biggest trouble spot per capita right now. Well, not even per capita. This is in total numbers. Even not looking per capita, Illinois has moved into the lead. And if we look at it per capita, per million people, which adjusts for the size of different states, the shape of these two, New York and New Jersey, stay roughly the same. But now we see that New Jersey, in some sense, had it pretty much as bad as New York, whereas in this graph it looks like it was a lot better in New Jersey. Not really. New Jersey was just as bad as New York. Not quite. It never quite peaked as high per million as New York did. But then we see these other states that aren't so obvious on the graph above that really do have it pretty bad, or did, like Rhode Island, very small state, but they were hit hard. Now they also did incredible testing, and having done that, because they did that, I am not going to make a definite statement about that, but it is a plausible hypothesis that the reason they peaked, even though they went so high, is because they did really good testing. But on the other hand, they still haven't shown that peak and rapid fall off that we've seen in New York and New Jersey. So Rhode Island is still having a little bit of trouble turning that curve around, just like the United States. I don't know that I really showed the United States. I'm gonna go back and pop a look at the United States again in the rope chart, just to say that it also, not the rope chart, I'm gonna look at it in the this is cases per million. United States is it's showing a downward trend, but for a couple weeks now it's been absolutely steady, right around 80 new cases per million across the United States. And the rope chart, for the United States, it is showing us a reduction for sure, and a consistent reduction, especially now that we've switched to the 7-day moving average, which gets rid of some of these little peaks that we can't see them now anymore actually, but the little daily peaks that were sometimes having the United States look worse. It's doing okay, dropping 1% a day over the long term. That will eventually get it over it, but it's not going to be having a shape like New York dropping 1% a day. New York was probably dropping 5 or 10% a day. Probably still is. We'll actually see that in the rope chart. In fact, let's look at it in the rope chart just to see. What is New York doing? Right now, New York is dropping 6% a day. And the speed at which New York is dropping is accelerating. So tomorrow it might be 7%. Next day it might be 8%. had a really good day recently. This is an average of 7 days. That were 7 consecutive days. The average was 16% drop. So this is what brings you a sharp downward trend. And we're not seeing that on Rhode Island. We're not seeing that on Massachusetts. We're not really seeing it on Connecticut. So New York and New Jersey, whatever they did it well, I guess, and they recovered. They are recovering very quickly. It's also possible that New York and New Jersey maybe, well, we see these numbers that suggest that 20% of New York has been infected. And so there may be some point at which the people who are most likely to get infected already are. Not to say it's necessarily herd immunity, but just the most likely infections are done, and then it starts to drop off, especially with the support of testing and lockdowns. But still, interesting, those two did really well, have done really well in their recovery. Other states aren't doing quite as well, Connecticut. But at least all the top 5 from a few weeks ago are trending downward, solidly downward. Maybe Massachusetts not so much. But then we see the ones that are our new contestants, which are Illinois, she keeps showing up, Maryland, Iowa, Virginia, and Minnesota. Where is Virginia? I was looking for Virginia earlier and I couldn't find it. I remembered Virginia being fairly low in this graph, but it's in the list, but it's actually right in the middle. Virginia was notable a few weeks ago in having terrible testing. It was the worst. It was always the worst in the top 25. So noted. But Virginia, Minnesota, Iowa, Maryland, and Illinois are on this graph appear to be headed upwards, and that's not good. They're seeing more new cases every day. And a few other ones are headed downward, Louisiana and Michigan, both looking pretty good. They have that hill shape. But the rope chart is my favorite because it is a little more predictive. It doesn't just say something like who's going up and who's going down, but it also says, are they accelerating in their growth rate, or are they decelerating? And so, first of all, at first glance, I'd say, interesting, this is not like the countries. We don't have horizontal lines so much. I see a lot of slightly downward lines when I squint, and then a few sharply upward lines. So the ones that are upward are the ones that are accelerating in their growth rate. Anyone above this 0 line is growing more new cases every day. If it's slanted upwards as it goes to the right, it's accelerating. So we see Minnesota, which I think has just showed up on our radar, and this is how it often works. Something appears on our radar because it is accelerating in growth rate, and because it's sprinting while the other states are jogging, it ends up overtaking someone, and I don't know quite who it overtook on the 24th or 25th place, but because Minnesota has a rather sharp growth rate, more than 10% daily, it is now moved into 24th place, and that's how it overtook the 24th and 25th. Now, what we usually see is this doesn't last. Minnesota is not going to stay at 10% for another week. It will start to drop and become a normal state with 5%, 0%, negative 5% in the coming weeks. But we'll see. If it becomes a new New York, then it will stay there forever and maybe grow to 20, and we'll see a huge effect from Minnesota. But right now it's small. It doesn't have that many cases. It's just showing a bad trajectory. We'll look at Minnesota's, how it compares to other states here per capita, just to see. So Minnesota, 100 cases per million every day. Worst ones were 400 cases per million every day. So Minnesota has to get 4 times as many cases every day as it has before it is competing with New York. On the other hand, it's quite clear it is rising, and so if it continues, and there's really no sense that it's dropping right now, if it continues in a month, it may have 400, and I think that's about what we saw for Qatar as well, wasn't it? 400 per million. So that's an extreme number. And Minnesota per capita has a lot right now. Other major players, Colorado and Arizona, are also looking like the worst. We'll talk about Colorado in a minute. Indiana and Louisiana, which had gotten better, have just crossed zero and are going at a pretty problematic clip. Washington also, which had really seemed like it had it in the bag and recovered, has crossed zero and is now seeing daily growth and with an accelerating upward trend. So Washington, though it had a long time with dropping cases to the point that it doesn't have that many cases anymore, still a major contender here, and one of the worst right now, Washington State. After a long period where it was one of the best, like here, where its growth rates were better than everyone else, Washington has now lost its momentum towards recovery and is looking unfortunate again. Now, as always, could it be testing? Sure it could. It sure could. All the states are accelerating testing. Maybe Washington here is just flushing out the last cases from the bushes, and when it's done that, then suddenly it will sharply drop again. We will watch. We know that testing is helping find new cases, and where we've seen this upward trend, which may be worrisome in the past couple weeks, but it does correspond to an upward trend of testing. So we don't know whether that's why we see an upward trend of new cases or whether there are real runaway epidemics happening in these locations. Now, talking about Colorado, I will say Colorado continues to be problematic because its data is very bad. We had pretty good data from Colorado, and then suddenly they had 5 or 7 days where their data was just whacked. A bunch of zeros, no new cases reported by coronadatascraper.com, which is my source, and then one day that probably combined all 5 of those days into one. And so for a while yet, there's going to be one of these 7-day data points that's just going to be pretty, especially this one right here. If we go back 7 days from April 27th, it's going to seem like we had an extraordinarily low number. You add these all up, divide by 7, and you get 10 or 20 or something, whereas everything else is in the hundreds or pushing 100. So Colorado's data has been problematic. Recently, however, for the past week, their data is looking better. Now, when you look at this graph, do you see a trend upwards, or do you see that it's flattened? Let me just pull it in a little closer. Is it trending upwards or is it flattening? Well, certainly the long-term trend is it was steep and now it's flattened out some. I'd say we're not looking at the line, but at the points, and we're ignoring all the ones down there and assuming they all would have been about in the same place. But I think there's an upward trend here. If you look at these days, these 3 are way above, and those are a little below, and that's in the middle. I don't know. It's certainly arguable that the trend here is right around 60 over there, or 65, and that is perfectly flat. Could be, but I see these as being a little lower than these ones here, and so my guess is that Colorado is still trending upward in new cases. Is it accelerating? Well, I don't quite believe that. It to me looks like it. At worst, it's a straight line, and really this line isn't too bad. This is a reasonable guess, maybe a little too sharp upwards at where Colorado is headed, and that it's flat to very slightly upwards and probably not accelerating. So those data points where we had the bad data have warped our trend line here, our rope chart sense of reality, to the point that it thinks that Colorado is growing 7% a day and accelerating rapidly. I don't really believe that. And this is important because Colorado is one of the first ones to unlock or start to unlock. And now we've had enough time there that if on the day that they unlocked, everyone went out and met their best friends in groups of less than 10, and they all caught coronavirus from the one of their best friends who already had it, we would expect now to see those cases incubated and showing up, and people showing up in hospitals getting tested, and we'd see an upswing. So Colorado and Georgia, we would expect to see a significant upswing of cases if the premature, some would say, lockdowns were really damaging. Now in Colorado, it's not obviously a spike. It might be a very slight upswing, but we're not seeing suddenly twice as many cases today or yesterday or the day before. They're really still following that 60 to 80 range per million. So Colorado, early data is in. Colorado does not seem to have shot itself in the foot or the head with this particular release of lockdown. Georgia, is even better. If we look at this graph, Georgia is clearly, I would say clearly, and certainly this line thinks so, headed downward. In the 10 or so days since they really started to unlock, or maybe it's been 14 by now, there's been, again, enough time for it to incubate, enough time for people to show up in hospitals, maybe even enough time for people to die from cases they caught due to the lifting of lockdown. And that is not happening. We can say that, or sure, there are cases that came from the lifting of lockdown. I'm sure there are some of those, but they are being offset by fewer cases elsewhere, by the general downtrend. And so Georgia especially is looking good. Colorado also looking pretty good. So, not sure. Texas Texas is, I think, trending upward according to this, but it's not clear that they've had some sort of dramatic uptick. And they've been a little slower in relaxing their lockdowns. At this point, almost everyone, all the states, have relaxed their lockdowns, at least to some small degree. I think 47 states or something have done some degree of relaxing their lockdowns. I'm not even sure there were 47 that had it to begin with. But in any case, that is good news. We've been waiting for this data to come in to see, would Colorado, would Georgia suddenly spike upwards on May 8th, 9th, 10th? The answer seems to be no. So at least it's not terrible. If there is damage due to the release of lockdown, it's being offset by other things. And remember, this is also in the context of greater testing. So we would expect a slight uptick just due to the acceleration of testing. And yet that's all being compensated by what probably is a reduction, a gradual reduction, steady reduction in the underlying rate of infection. So this is good news. At the same time, the bad news is that most states are still showing positive growth rates. So at some point, there have been times during this series where we've seen almost everyone below zero, and then it swung back upwards. You can really see this on this graph. There was a real swing upwards about 3 weeks ago, and I started to say, why is this happening? I hope it's testing. And we're seeing, I'd say, a little more evidence now that it really is testing that's causing the upswing in these lines. But then you say Minnesota and think, probably not just testing. Minnesota probably really does have a problem with new cases. And maybe Louisiana as well, but maybe it's all testing. On the bright side, we have all these states below zero and accelerating downward. There are a lot of them. Rhode Island, New York. Of course, New York is the major contributor of cases, or at least it has been. So for a while, New York's steady drop has been really helping the national numbers. Now, as New York shrinks out of relevance, all these other ones are going to start to be important, and we're going to start to see probably a period where the United States as a whole will see a growth of new cases as the other 48 states plus territories start to have more cases, even while New York and New Jersey see a drop. Rhode Island, Georgia, interestingly, according to the rope chart, is one of our best right now. 6% daily drop of new cases and accelerating fairly quickly downward. So Georgia is one of the ones we've really been keeping an eye on. How is Georgia doing? Given that they were unlocking before the federal guidelines recommended it and before a lot of other people recommended it, they do not seem to have suffered at this point from that. They seem to be doing fine. They're number 3 in their growth rate, and they're getting better. New Jersey, Michigan also was potentially problematic. Connecticut, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, Ohio. Ohio's just crossed zero. It had that very brief mini epidemic in a prison, and then it got over it, and the state as a whole never seems to have gotten it that bad, and now we see that it's crossed the zero line again and is trending downward. I do want to pop back to the national, or the countries just briefly, because I think I forgot to look at Brazil and Sweden. Brazil and Sweden are the Colorado and Georgia of the world, in the sense that they didn't do as much to lock down or to control the coronavirus outbreak using governmental action as other places. We look at these, they're steady as all the countries are. Still, this is strange. I can't explain it. Why so many countries are showing this. Oops, now I've done it. Are showing this steady horizontal pattern for the past couple weeks. I would expect that you would recover and head downward if you were up here, or at least it's if not, it wouldn't be every country doing that. But that's what Brazil is doing. Brazil is holding fairly steady around 7%. It is definitely growing and has been for a long time. It's not accelerating, but it's in a pretty bad state compared to, in fact, if you compare it to everyone else, I think it's about the worst. There's Brazil. And it's one of the worst in terms of its growth rate, but it's not accelerating. No one really is, except for Iran, I guess. And then Sweden, which took a pretty mild approach to the epidemic control, is right around the zero line, not shrinking much, not growing, not accelerating, not decelerating. It's just right there in the middle. So Sweden at least didn't make a terrible fool of itself, it seems, in the way that it behaved. It's in the middle. It's not coming out with shining colors when it comes to the number of new cases, but it's not the worst either. So when deciding whether to open or how to open, those who want to emphasize mental health or economic growth, take note of Sweden. They don't seem to have suffered too much in cases and deaths by opening up. That's what we seem to be seeing there. And of course, there are always a lot of factors that go into these things. So eventually we'll have better studies than this very crude analysis of reported cases. But some evidence suggests that Sweden did okay with their decision. Let's move on to the counties of California. I'm going to reload this again. Maybe pop into the states for a minute again. Let's look at states by... I'm afraid I just lost some of my audience by saying we're moving to the counties, but those of you who stayed anyway, we'll look briefly. Rhode Island continues to do great at 8%. New York, Massachusetts, Louisiana. The worst one is Arizona. Now, Virginia used to be kind of terrible in testing, and I guess it still kind of is, but it's passed a few of them. And then in terms of daily, the main thing to notice here is that everyone is testing more and more cases every day. If they'd reached some sort of capacity and they were testing as many as they possibly could and weren't adding any new capacity, we'd see all these lines horizontal. Instead, they're pretty much all sloping upwards. So everyone is adding capacity and using it, even the states that don't have a real epidemic. And so this is a good trend. The capacity is growing slowly but steadily, and as it goes, we'll see these lines accelerate, and we see that especially in places like Louisiana, where these final dots being above the trend line suggest that Louisiana is accelerating upward. This after being very steady for a while. So Louisiana seemed to reach a capacity of a sort. They reached some sort of maximum, and then they figured out how to do more tests. However they did that, I don't know. Maybe they sent in other states, maybe they built new labs, but Louisiana is now back on track and is again a major competitor. California and Colorado. Colorado is fairly bad in terms of testing. California, it's at least at the top of bad now, but also fairly bad in terms of testing. Neither of those are major are the major leaders in testing, and this is per capita, percent of the population tested every day. All right, looking at counties, Los Angeles, of course, always the leader. We have in total Riverside, San Diego, Orange. It's really hard to look at this graph and figure out what's going on. Yes, we're getting more cases. That will always be the case until every last cases, until we eradicate the virus from the population, which is by no means certain will happen anytime soon or maybe ever. So I tend to go to the daily cases. Los Angeles continues to have more and more daily cases, it seems. There's an upward slant here. That's not good. If we, let's go to the per million, just to break it down. Per million, Los Angeles is not the leader. The leader right now is Imperial. Imperial just keeps showing up. And it popped onto the top 25 a week ago, and it was, I kept saying, people were saying in the chat, small population. It's true, and yet Imperial keeps showing up. Small population though it has, when adjusted for population, it is way up there with everybody, with all the worst counties, and headed upwards. More and more new cases every day. So this is probably not a testing thing. Imperial probably, I'm just guessing wildly here, I guess, but I don't think, let's just look at Imperial's testing, see if I can do something. Imperial. So Imperial's in the middle of the pack in testing. And yet, in total cases, daily cases, new daily cases, they are at the lead of the pack. So, roughly speaking, I'd say that probably means that Imperial is not just seeing all these cases because it's testing a whole lot more. It's seeing them because they're really there, and it's seeing them probably because they're growing. And so where Imperial was a small county in number 25 or number 24, now look at it, it's risen to 17th or something, and just keeps going. So Imperial, I think Imperial has a real problem. That said, they do have a small population. They're probably not going to be the one that catapults California into the lead of states, but if you live in Imperial, I'd be worried. Tulare, Kings, kind of the same, rising. Los Angeles also, which seemed to be doing better, now rising. Now in that case, maybe it really is a testing thing, because there has been some evidence that Los Angeles is fifth in the state in testing. It's tested 2% of the population, a respectable amount. There's been some evidence that they have an excess of testing capacity, and that people are now getting tested who don't really need it, and so or at least who don't have symptoms, and so we may now be uncovering cases in Los Angeles that just wouldn't have been uncovered through the hospital system. They'd only be uncovered by someone going to a doctor's office and saying, I want an antibody test, or I want a test for the virus. And if there are enough tests, if there's enough testing capacity now that the doctor can give that to someone who has no symptoms, then we will see a rise like this, as the asymptomatic people, which is at least half of all cases are asymptomatic, and we sometimes hear much higher numbers than that. But if half of cases are asymptomatic, someone goes to the doctor for a regular checkup, doctor says, would you like a test? I heard someone in California just was offered a test at the doctor's office, no symptoms, they just said, would you like a test? And they said no, actually, but they could have gotten that test if they wanted it, and they might have become one of the contributors to this sort of statistic. San Diego, also rising, it looks like San Francisco. The good shapes here are Riverside, which has sometimes been a real problem spot. Santa Barbara, really? I thought there was some bad news about Santa Barbara. Well, Santa Barbara, at first glance, looks pretty good. It seems to have peaked and dropped. Riverside, Santa Barbara, and a few others. San Joaquin, Sacramento. Let's look at and I guess I didn't really talk about them, or did I? The ones that are problems. No, I did. I talked about, for instance, Imperial, Kings, Tulare, Los Angeles, and a few others, Kern, Fresno, a few others that aren't looking so good. But where are they headed? So the rope chart again is looking a little bit more sedate these days versus some of my past ones, because we are doing a 7-day moving average instead of a 3-day moving average. That does kind of flatten the lines out a little bit. But again, we're not seeing anything, not like what we saw at the country's level where everyone's horizontal. We see a lot of slightly upward trending ones and a lot of downward trending ones, and as a whole there's a sense that things are going upwards. So we certainly have a lot more counties above zero than below right now. There's the zero mark, the slightly wider horizontal line with a zero at the left, the white horizontal line here. all the counties that are currently above that are growing in new cases, new reported cases. All the ones below it are shrinking. So San Joaquin is looking great. Marin, San Luis Obispo, Sacramento's not too bad. It's trending upwards, but at least it's shrinking every day. But the rate of shrinkage is dropping. Contra Costa, Riverside, Los Angeles, and then a couple of these right on the edge here, San Mateo and Stanislaus, are just crossing zero right now, it seems, and heading towards negative growth. But then we have this giant cluster. Tulare certainly has the highest growth rate, over 10%, accelerating. That looks problematic. San Francisco, which seemed like it was doing well, now accelerating. However, let's look at the testing rates. Look at this, San Francisco. Coincidence? I don't think so. San Francisco has tested almost coming up on 4% of the population. They've tested more than any other county in the state. They are accelerating suddenly, rather dramatically, way above the trend line. Testing is San Francisco. And now we see San Francisco has a whole lot of new reported cases. Now in this case, I'd say surely, I can't prove it, but surely the correlation is here, and surely the part of the reason, maybe even the major reason that San Francisco is seeing new reported cases is because they're testing like crazy people. And so I think San Francisco is probably doing well in spite of having a 7% upward trend and accelerating. With that level of testing, I think San Francisco is probably headed in a matter of weeks, maybe days. It's headed towards flattening off here, dropping back towards zero, and getting better. But the straight reading of the data just says San Francisco is the second worst in growth rate and in acceleration of growth rate. So, is it due to testing? Is there an epidemic in San Francisco? Well, time will tell. As the testing continues to ramp up, we will eventually peak and drop, and I don't think it's going to be because everyone in San Francisco gets it. That's not why we're going to peak. I think we're going to peak because this mad testing rate is going to catch up to the underlying cases that we didn't know about. Sonoma, Ventura, similarly, but those are not quite as dramatic in their. Sonoma is fairly small anyway. They don't have a huge testing rate. Ventura also not a huge testing rate. 1.5% tested isn't bad, but they're not doing this testing blitz that San Francisco is. How about Los Angeles? Los Angeles right now is looking okay in its growth rate. It certainly has the most cases. If we actually looked here, yeah, Los Angeles, let's take a look at this. So this is where the rope chart can differ from common sense or where this can differ from common sense, because there are really two common senses here. Has Los Angeles seen a peak right here that has dropped away ever since with a couple of outliers? Or has San Francisco seen a low point here that has grown and grown and grown and grown steadily with a week of outliers? I don't know, but this graph thinks that San Francisco is growing. The rope chart, I tend to believe more, thinks that Los Angeles, looking at the more short-term trends, thinks Los Angeles is actually headed in a better direction. They used to see 140 every day, now at per million. Now they see only 80 every day. So there's a downward trend, and I wouldn't even call it a mini trend because it is weeks and weeks long. A downward trend for Los Angeles. But on the other hand, we have some extremely high days in the past couple weeks. So Los Angeles is kind of all over the map here. But the rope chart says, and I kind of believe it, that it's headed in a good direction, slightly negative growth and getting better. And we've already pretty much looked at testing. San Francisco leads, Riverside doing very well, Marin, San Diego, Los Angeles doing quite well in its testing. And then some of the ones that aren't doing so well, Monterey, Fresno, Solano. So that's the news for the day. And if you just look at the graphs, the news seems to get worse every day for California. We seem to have more and more of these above-the-line accelerating trends. But as we saw in the case of San Francisco, there's a very plausible hypothesis here that says it's because we're testing so much more. That's why we're finding new cases. that that hypothesis leads to that theory leads to, it's a testable hypothesis, and I'm the test for that hypothesis is to wait a few days and see if it continues to grow exponentially upwards, or does it peak and drop away. At least if the testing is catching up to underlying cases, I would expect it to peak and drop away. There are other reasons that could make that happen, so it doesn't really prove anything, but still, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say I expect San Francisco to peak and drop away in a matter of days as this extremely high level of testing catches its cases. And I think that we'll see this for all these counties. I don't know this for sure, but my guess is that the upward negative results we're seeing for these counties is more a result of the very high acceleration of testing that we're seeing than a result of underlying infection. But we'll see. It could totally be that we have runaway epidemic in 20 counties in California. If so, then testing isn't going to solve that. At least it's not. If it's if the rates are this high, testing is just going to keep uncovering more and more and more, and we're not going to be able to trace them fast enough, and we're going to see these grow and grow and grow, and that is what would happen if testing is not the main factor in this growth. In the state level, again, we've seen. Bring that rope chart back if I can. We're seeing kind of the same thing. Still a lot of states growing. We do have a real cluster of winner states here. We don't have any winners in counties. No obvious winners. But among the states, there are some clear winners here. New York, New Jersey, and the rest who seem to have gotten over it and are headed downward. But then a lot of states aren't. And at the level of nations, countries, we have the same thing where there are some clear winners, Europe, and those, of course, who've gotten over it, like China, who seems to have gotten over it to the point that they're not even showing up here, or South Korea. But then there are still a lot of countries that are above this line. So across all different granularities, countries, states, and counties, the news is mixed. The raw data indicates a cause for alarm. But there still is this hypothesis about testing that is compatible with the data and indicates that we may be doing just fine. We'll be keeping an eye on that in the days to come. Thanks for watching. My name is Greg Farrar.